Okay, I think we're about to get started. Thank you everyone for being here. I'd like to just take a moment to remind everyone to please silence your cell phones before we begin. Thank you for joining us for an overview of the geopolitics and history of Russia, Ukraine, and Crimea. Colleen Kelly, PhD, is a retired teacher of Asian, International Studies, and Comparative Education. She taught in Fairfield, Connecticut. She was a peer fellow at Yale University for both Asian and International Studies, and she has lectured widely on India, China, Russia, and the Middle East. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you and good afternoon. Yeah, that's
You
fine.
can be quite far away from it. But
Oh, okay, very good. Can you identify the various images that are around the first picture here? What do we have over here? I think the Grand Dukes. And on the far side? The Mongols. And then I think we recognize the geopolitics of Ukraine, Russia, and Crimea offers us an overview of the growth of Ukraine from a wealthy Slavic farming and trading city, and Russia from its beginnings as in the Kievan Rus state. The importance of Crimea as a port, a warm water port. Remember those words, warm water port, WWP. Originally settled by the Khaganate of the Golden Horde, that's the Mongol state, is illustrated by the absence of warm water ports in Russia. The far northern latitude of Russia caused it to be virtually landlocked by Arctic ice. Now that's changing, and keep that in mind. Dominance of the steppe area near the Black Sea by the Mongols had caused Russians to seek asylum in the wooded taiga region, where the Russians founded the city of Moscow. Most of the world, as you can see by this chart, is water. But if you don't have access to it, you won't be a great power. How would you describe Russia? Mammoth, yes. And in this view, it covers half the land area of the world. It's a Eurasian state, meaning, yeah, it's both European and Asian. Because Russia needed to have access to the ports for trade with the Byzantine Empire, they sought access to the Black Sea. Now, when we're talking about geopolitics and history, definitions probably help a little bit, just to tuck in the back of our minds. When we're talking about geopolitics, it's the study of geographic influences on power relations in international politics. Russia lies on the Great Eurasian Plain. Therefore, it's vulnerable to invasions from the east and the south through the steppe or the plain. Consequently, Russia's constant foreign policy depends upon maintaining a buffer of satellite states. This policy was incorporated both into the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. With the dismemberment of Russia in 1991, they tried to establish a coalition of independent states friendly to Russia. For the most part, that didn't materialize. And some of the former buffer states became independent, more aligned with Western Europe. Russia saw itself as a consequence as threatened on all sides. Russia's historical dependence on autocratic rulers leads to the expectation and the celebration of strong men as rulers. The West might confer a Nobel Prize on Gorbachev for his policies of economic openness and free speech. Russia saw him in a totally different light, as weak and destructive. So to better understand Russia's historical attitude and its geographic limitations is to appreciate their current attitude about Putin's actions. We have three geographic realities, facts, that act as constraints to its power and sustainability. A very high northern latitude, which means what? It's very cold, but it also has a short growing season. And at least before we have had some rather dramatic climatic change, it is landlocked for much of the year. Now, each of these facts has caused Russia to act in certain ways throughout its history, and that does not bear upon its form of government in any way. We can see their need and the fact that it has expanded to the east, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Russia fought a war with, anybody know? Japan, right. And why? Why did it try to defeat Japan? It didn't. Japan defeated it, but it needed a port. And Teddy Roosevelt obliged, winning the Nobel Prize for Peace. So that provided Russia with a two-ocean navy. Russia's search for warm water ports brought not only Vladivostok, but earlier on, which other great city? St. Petersburg, right. That was built on land that they seized after a war with Sweden. And Crimea was first gained from what neighbor? The Ottoman Turks, right. And that was under a non-Russian female czar by the name of? Yep, you got it. So these ports enabled Russia to grow to the status of a great power over time by gaining access to the Baltic Sea to the north, the Black Sea, and consequently the Mediterranean Sea. Then through that to the Atlantic Ocean, and to the east, the Pacific Ocean. As Russia grew in size, spreading over 11 time zones, it found itself, well, when it was the Soviet Union, it was more than that. But now it finds itself with still another grave vulnerability. And this is one that continued as it grew. It lay on the great Eurasian plain with no natural barrier from Paris all the way to the Ural Mountains. Now, if you look at the Ural Mountains, they help us, let's see, right there. That was the dividing line for invaders. The Urals did provide a refuge from invaders, and it was used by the Russians themselves very strategically with retreats. But the southern plains were still open to invasion from Asia. Okay. Russia's terrain can roughly be divided into 4 major sections. There are subdivisions, but we won't deal with them. Those are the tundra, taiga, steppe, and desert. Tundra is up here to the north. Taiga is this huge area in green. The steppe is this lower section that you can see going all the way into Siberia. And what they're left with now after the dissolution of the Soviet Union is just a very small section of semi-desert. The rest of that is incorporated into newly formed states or stans. I think you get a slightly better view of that with the topographical map. And part of what you see with this, if you notice, the mountainous areas of Russia are primarily in its south. That, therefore, tilts the country so that it goes downward toward the north. That causes its Siberian rivers to flow south, but north. Okay, it's strange, but when we come up to the Ural Mountains, that is open to invasion, historically and still. So that is a determination for Russia of its foreign policy. Russia's ecosystems, then, we can define. The tundra is about 11%, but that's in the process of changing, and a very interesting article, if you want to access it in the current history, is on the climatic impact of tundra no longer sustaining its frozen aspect. Taiga is the most extensive area, divided actually into 2 different kinds of vegetation. To the west, we have a deciduous forest, and to the east, it's boreal forest. And then across Russia's southern flank is that steppe or plain which we observed. Today, that small area of desert is retained by the Russian Federation, but the independent stans, that is Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkestan, and Tajikistan, have their deserts, the former Russian deserts. Let's move to a look at the people and from the people to the history. If we look at the populations of Ukraine, Crimea, and Russia, they've changed over a relatively brief period of time. I'm taking a century as being relatively brief. We start with 1897 and come up to basically today, or the 21st century. When we started, the majority of people in the Ukraine were Ukrainian, with just a small percent, or largish minority, of Russians. In 1959, the Russian part of the population was somewhat changed. I think I've skipped a section here a little bit. We're looking at Ukrainian, Crimean, and Tartar, or as being our populations. And we're looking here at the historical Crimean population. In 1959, most of the population of Crimea had been deported to Siberia or to the desert. By 2001, after a change of the government's control, Crimea's population had become largely Russian, with the Tatars and the Ukrainians sizable but distinct minorities. Excuse me. Go back in time and we can find the classical Scythians, known to the Greek historians, primarily Herodotus, who described them as hashish-using barbarians. Now remember, according to the Greeks, anybody who wasn't Greek was a barbarian. You've got it. They were, these Scythians, skilled horsemen, and they commissioned many beautiful items from the Greek goldsmiths. Perhaps at one time or another you may have seen some of that collection that Peter the Great accumulated. For centuries, various tribes migrated from east to west across Eurasia. They circled the seas, they crossed the steppes and the deserts to eventually cause the collapse of the great empires of the West. When the Greeks were talking about barbarians, it meant not only a foreigner, but to them, uncivilized non-city dwellers. The various tribal lands that began to occupy this part of Europe, occupied lands not already seized by migrating peoples. And around the region that we now know as Russia and Ukraine, we had settlements by Slavonic tribes, Baltic tribes, etc. The Khazarian Empire was formed where today Crimea and areas to the east are located. They encompassed the Volga River that flows into the Caspian Sea. Now, even though the Caspian Sea is called a sea, it's not really a sea, it's a lake, right? And as a result, has no outlet to the sea. You can have a vigorous trade, but it's all basically internal. Early Slavic settlements were basically distinguished by language, and they became the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, who are today the Belarus, the Russians, and so forth. The early Slavs came from Indo-European lands, and they spread across those parts of Asia into Eastern Europe about 2000 BC. And now, under the pressure of nomadic hordes, the Slavic tribes crossed the Carpathian Mountains and pushed their way down to the Balkans. Others moved westward toward the upper Danube, and still others eastward toward the Dnieper River and the Black Sea. That migration continued from the 4th through the 8th centuries, giving birth to the Slavic nations that we know today. The early Slavic warriors came at about 600, the Christian era, and they found that rather than trek all the way to Rome, they were better sort of doubling back toward the Black Sea because there was good fertile land, rich earth that they could farm, and the Dnieper River is one of the longest rivers in Europe. Now, I'm sure those of you who speak Russian or are familiar with the languages know that I do not speak Russian, so my mispronunciations, I beg you to forgive. The Dnieper River in Ukraine is extremely important. Take a look and see if there are some familiar names that you find there. Now notice, Chernobyl is right in some of the most fertile land on earth. Kiev was the beginning of a great city, a great trading center, and what they wanted to do was trade down the river, all the way down to Istanbul, to the Byzantine Empire. We can see some of those trade routes. That lasted for several hundred years. And the only interruption came when some northern visitors decided to take over that trade. They were the Vikings, or Varangians, or Norsemen. They came from the north, and later still, we had, coming from the east, the Mongols across those southern steppes. They interfered a bit with that trade route. We can move on to the early history and take a look and see some of the points, those Slavic settlements of the 600s, Byzantine trade, the coming of the Vikings, who were the Rus, at about 800 AD. The Slavs become peasants. They had been free and prosperous tradesmen and farmers. The Rus established themselves as nobles, and then dynasties are established, new settlements. Vladimir Christianizes Kiev. The Mongol Conquest comes around the 1200s, and some broke off, went up into the forest, and established Moscow. The Rus probably gave Russia its name, and the leader of the Rus was a gentleman by the name of Rurik. That tribe conquered the Slavic farmers and established a two-tiered class system. The descendants of the Vikings were the nobles, and the peasants were the descendants of the Slavs. Rurik was a Varangian, and he adopted the title of Grand Duke, beginning the House of Rurik. Now, in all of Imperial Russia's history, there were really only two dynasties, the Rurikoviches and the Romanovs. The princes of Kievan Russia fought among themselves, and as a result, they expanded and founded new cities. In fact, naming one new city, Novgorod. One account, there are two different accounts of the founding of Kiev, and they depend on who's telling the historical tale. The Slavs tell it as having gone back about 1,400 years in time, and that it was, something similar to the founding of Rome, with various brothers and sisters and so forth establishing their leadership. The emergence of a great city came, and it supposedly had been prophesied by St. Andrew. Gradually, they acquired their trade and a great East Slavic civilization. Kiev's golden age as the center of Kievan Rus Times was in the 10th to the 12th centuries. A somewhat different chronology is in the Russian primary chronicle. And according to them, the Slavs were having a hard time of it. So to boil it down, essentially what they did was invite Rus and the Vikings to come down and conquer them. So the present inhabitants of Novgorod are descended from the Varangians, but before that they were Slavs. Now, one of the most important historical figures of this time period is Saint Vladimir. He was a warrior, and he fought for control, gained position and power by fighting his half-brothers. Vladimir sent delegates around. He looked for a way, how am I going to unite this disparate empire that I have? And he decided, well, I think maybe if I have religion, something that'll cause the people to come together, that will help me. So he sent emissaries around, had them examine which are the best possibilities. And he explored every single possible religion that he could find. He selected Orthodox Christianity because he was very, very impressed by the ceremonies, the length of it, the beauty of it. And incidentally, he could establish a very profitable marriage. He married the sister of the Byzantine emperor. Good move, because that laid the ground for the later claim of Russia to being a third Rome. And he also established a council of boyars or nobles and built a platform with them to support an autocracy. Now, about this early period of time still, around the time of Batu Khan, who is the grandson of Genghis Khan, we find three empires. The Holy Roman Empire, I moved it too soon, sorry. Go back a bit. Doesn't want to go back. Let me see. There we go. The Holy Roman Empire, the Muscovy Empire, and the Byzantine Empire. Those were the ones that were important around this period of time. When the Mongol invasion occurred, about half the Russian population is said to have died, but another source says they were about 7.5 million, and probably 7 million survived. The Mongol warlords, as we may be familiar, used terror and mass extermination as their means of expansion and control. And that was a very well-tested Mongol tactic. And it's been adopted by a number of other entities. What happened as a result? Depopulation, severe depopulation. Whole populations were massacred if a town or a city didn't immediately surrender to the Mongols. They'd come up and say, "We're your friendly Mongols, surrender." If you did, fine. If you didn't, goodbye. Timur the Great, who ruled between 1336 and 1405, was particularly destructive. It's said that mountains of skulls of his army's victims remained visible for several years after a massacre. Just a gentle reminder. And further, conquered regions had to supply troops for the Mongol army. The Mongols never expended great numbers of their own people. They always had their conquered people in the front lines. The invasions crippled the economy of the conquered areas. And they left, the Mongols established puppet rulers who adopted the term, the title of Grand Duke. Alexander Nevsky in Russia is a good example of one of these conquered rulers. And what they basically were tax collectors. They would be the middleman between the Mongols and the people. If they didn't get what they wanted, then they used the Mongol army to burn, rape, pillage, and destroy, execute a ruler who was at fault, and then install a new puppet. There were separate Khanates of Crimea when we approach mid-15th century. So the Mongol Tartar state existed from around 1242 until the 15th century. I like this to establish who owned what at the particular time. There was a prince, Daniel Romanovich, who strove to form a coalition of European states to combat the Golden Horde, but they really were not adequate to it. Here we can see the Grand Horde, the Crimean Khanate that breaks down, and then the Ottoman Empire separately. Around 1500, we had established probably the largest empire the world has ever seen, which was the Mongol Empire. And this is the period of time of the Silk Road, established linking Europe and Mongolia, Asia. By 1500, however, Mongol dominance began to wane, and a new empire, the Chinese Empire, known as the Ming, was expanding its influence. The Ottomans had overthrown the Byzantine Empire, and there were Christian monarchs in Spain and Portugal who had defeated their Muslim peoples. And they laid the foundation for a new overseas empire. Now we come back a bit to that geographic component, and that's the fact that those eastern rivers run north. Russia's short growing season meant that they needed to expand to the south. They needed to seek warm water ports. And none of the European rivers gave them access to the sea, which was for trade. So for much of the year, the waters near Russia, as well as the rivers, were frozen, constantly causing that warfare pushing to their south. So geographic and geologic limitations determined Russia's political choices. So they had a geographic quandary. Where were the people settled? Most of them were settled in the European part of what we call Russia today. Without control of the Crimea, which is shown here as a Ukrainian territory, Russia had little access to the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, or the Atlantic. So they sought out control of the Crimea. Now, from its very earliest days, Russia demonstrated that it really needed to have protection from a series of buffer states along the Great Eurasian Plain. So it incorporated that into both the Russian Empire and the USSR, and even today in the RSFSR. Here's Russia without benefit of the buffer states. And note the location of the Urals. They're a third of the land, of the landmass of Russia, inland from Europe. This is another topographical look, and I think it gives you a comprehensive idea of just how easy it was for invaders to come from the European side into Russia. Now, what are the consequences of some of these points? Going back and just summing up a little bit, that vulnerability to invasion meant that the Scyths, the Mongols, the Poles, the French, and the Germans all invaded, and in most instances, conquered that European section of Russia. So if you were a Russian, what would you do? Well, yeah, you'd fight back, but what else would you do? You'd move east or you'd move north. The invaders didn't want to go north. And there was more protection as you went north, because what type of vegetation zone were you moving into? Into the taiga. So not easy for a horseman to come into a forest. So due both to the barrier of the mountains and the high northern location, the majority of Russia's population within the European region of Russia moved north and, as you said, east. They went to Siberia. Now, Siberia, Sibir, what do you hear? Severe, that's right. That served as a place for serfs to escape from bondage, and for nobles or the literati out of favor with the new ruler to be sent into exile. And additionally, it was an actual prison of many, many gulags. Whole populations, such as the Tatars of Crimea, were sent to the gulags, both basically by Stalin, or to the deserts to extract resources for Russia's industrialization during the 5-year campaigns. That's in the 20s through the 30s and 40s. Okay, once again, we look and we see some of the historical timeline. The Mongol Empire expansion across Eurasia took advantage of the southern steppes, crossed below the Urals. Now, the Mongols were phenomenal horsemen. They had no fear of anyone else because of the techniques and methods that they used, but everybody else was in terror of the Mongol horsemen. So it was possible for the Mongol generals to communicate from the Black Sea to their capital in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. Guess, if I went back to one of the maps, what would be the length of time you would estimate? And we're looking now at up to the 1500s. How long would it take them? A month? Any other guess? 2 weeks. They established what we might compare with a Pony Express. They had stations with their wonderful horses every few miles. They had horsemen who would dismount, another group would get on, carry their messages back. 2 weeks. Phenomenal. Now, up here in the taiga, Muscovy was established in 1480. It was tripled in size, go to that darker beige, by 1689. Peter the Great first added access to the sea by his conquest of Sweden and establishment of St. Petersburg in 1725. The great port city was built by serfs and prisoners of war. 100,000 perished in the process. Now, when we talk about a Kremlin, what are we really talking about? It's a fortress. And it was made out of what material? The available material. They were in the taiga. So they could build them out of the wood, the timber of the forest. But the Mongol horsemen couldn't cross into those forested areas too easily. And they also found that the ice and the rivers were a detriment to their ability to continue what they had in the desert steppes. The Grand Dukes, those tax collectors for the Mongols, began to say, this is a pretty good deal. Maybe I should just keep what I'm collecting for myself. And since they had a whole array of tax collectors that they had established, and they paid, what they would do would be keep a loyal group of military around them. The first of the Grand Dukes to really challenge the Mongols was Ivan III, about 1481. His grandson, Ivan IV, expanded that territory, and he managed the final defeat of the Mongols. Okay, what are we left with? The Rurikoviches, or they're sometimes called Rurikids, in that early period. The Romanovs, through the 1613 with Michael, up till 1917 when Nikolas II was forced to abdicate. Revolution comes along in 1917, and after civil wars, etc., we have them maintaining power until 1991. And now, from 1991 on, we have the Russian Federation. Really have been two types of rulers then in Russia: autocrats and oligarchs. And in that article that I mentioned from Current History, I love this, a new term, authoritarian kleptocracy. I love it. Ivan III was called the Great because of what he did in enlarging the state and turning back the Mongols. And he's the first one to appropriate the term czar to be equivalent to ruler. Now, he didn't necessarily appropriate it to himself. That was left to his grandson. But it establishes that, because czar is Caesar, that they are establishing a claim to following the power of Rome, therefore a third Rome. Ivan IV, what do we sometimes call him? Not really a very good translation. The Awesome is probably better. He was an extremely tall gentleman, monumental in size, and probably had a few problems mentally, but despite that, he was successful. He established himself taking the title of czar, and he ruled as an autocrat. He began the Forbidden Years, forcing the peasants into serfdom at exactly the same time that Europe was exiting serfdom. So Russia enforced a system comparable to slavery. It was different from medieval serfdom. In medieval serfdom, the serfs had certain rights guaranteed by the church, which was the third balancing power for the rulers. Not so in Russia. In Russia, the church became subordinate to the czar. Now, we could have some fun taking all of the czars, but we'll skip ahead and take another great, Peter the Great, who was a great westernizer. He enjoyed spending about 2 years in Europe, Western Europe, and when he did that, he said, "Oh, that's good. I'll bring that back. Oh, that's good. I'd like to imitate that. Oh, this is good. I can do better." So he founded St. Petersburg after his war with Sweden. He established a regular army and a navy, because now he had access to what? Right, at least part of the year. He industrialized Russia, opening up the first factories, and he pushed downward toward Istanbul, trying to gain those southern warm water ports, always with an eye on Crimea, right you are. He elevated the state over the church, and surprise, surprise, he brought women into public life. Now, notice the big difference in time that we're looking at. From 1725, when Peter fell off or dove into the water to save a sailor and died as a result, Catherine the Great came to the throne. Now, who was Catherine? Was she a great Russian ruler? Yes, she was a great Russian ruler, but she wasn't Russian. She was the self-made widow and successor of Peter the Third. You like that? She was neither a Romanov nor a Russian. She was born Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst, and she was a royal but poor relation. She succeeded in achieving Peter's ambition of seizing Crimea, and she did that in 1783. She went on to absorb Poland and other border territories, thereby protecting Russia's flanks and opening another outlet to the Western world. Now, her grandson was considered to be probably the very model of a modern major general. We might have heard those words before, Gilbert and Sullivan. Catherine's grandson, Alexander, began as a very liberal ruler. He wanted to remake the autocracy into a constitutional monarchy. And he absolutely idolized Napoleon. He thought Napoleon was just perfect until Napoleon invaded Russia in the War of 1812. And as the French entered into Russia, if you want to hear that battle, listen to Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture. You can absolutely hear the entire battle. The Russian forces simply fought a little bit, withdrew, fought a little bit, withdrew, withdrew, withdrew. Now, I don't want to really call it retreat, because what are they actually doing? They're bringing the French into the interior of Russia. Now, what is it that Russia has that France doesn't? Abnormally cold, icy conditions, particularly in the winter, yes? So we have the Russian forces having these strategic retreats to the other side of the Ural Mountains. And when they fought the battle for control of Moscow, and Moscow burned, what did the Russians do? Did they stand their ground and fight? No, they retreated. You can have it. We'll come back when you've tried to survive this winter. So General Winter is the general who defeated Napoleon. During a 500-year span, then, we see the expansion according to who the ruler was, what the particular necessity was, and this section, let's see, that's where Catherine expanded. Very strategic, because it included what? Crimea. All right, Nikolas the First succeeded his brother Alexander the First. Now, Alexander the First was really a very good man in many ways, and there's a wonderful historical myth about his death. True or not, we really don't know. But we know that on December 14th of 1825, he died. Now, there was the rumor up until after the death of Nicholas that there was a monk in, I think it's the monastery of Zagorsk, who looked amazingly like Alexander. And now this is all story, that when they opened Alexander's coffin, Guess what? He wasn't in it. So whether he became a monk or whether he actually died makes no difference. His brother Nikolas came to the throne. Nikolas had not been prepared to rule. Nikolas was a military man, and he was good in certain ways, but he made some mistakes. He said, I've got all these farmers, I've got all these serfs, I'll make them my army. Now what happens when you force somebody into the army? Not only that, they wouldn't just retreat, because retreat can be an organized action. They would run away. He who runs away lives to fight another day. So he thought that the actions of his brother Alexander were somewhat silly. And he didn't like liberal thinkers. He didn't like some of these great writers and poets who had arisen during Alexander's time period. He thought, oh, let's just send them all to Siberia, right? Nikolas squashed any semblance of free speech. He sentenced liberal writers to death, although at the last moment, if he happened to like their writing, he would retract that. Turned Dostoevsky from a liberal to a very conservative thinker. We have some of the greatest writers of the 19th century Russia during this time period, going through all types of tribulation here. Now, in order to maintain control over the Crimea, Nikolas went to war with Turkey, and allies of the Turks came in. They were Britain and France. Now, why would they come and be allies of the Turks? They wanted to maintain Russia's isolation. They wanted to bottle that state up and keep it without access to the sea. The Crimean War lasted about 3 years. Nikolas died not as a result of fighting in the war, but just natural cause during the war. You may remember a couple of names and events in the Crimean War. 1853 to 1856. What were we doing at that time in this country? No, not the Civil War yet, 1861. We were pushing slavery westward. So we had events like Bleeding Kansas. Remember that? The Missouri Compromise, all of those things going on. We had fairly weak presidents at that point who wouldn't take a stand one way or the other. Russia was upset with the Crimean War, and it wasn't going in their favor. But there were huge losses on the part of the Allies. So they weren't too keen on anything there either. And we remember Alfred Lord Tennyson's charge of the Light Brigade. Who else do we remember from this? Florence Nightingale. She absolutely transformed the concept of nursing and care of the wounded. Now, by 1880, acquisitions from the Ottoman Empire, the Crimea was absorbed in 1783, had extended Russia's control southward. Who came after Nikolas the First? His son. Now, his son was Alexander II, and he was a contemporary of Abraham Lincoln. They actually sent letters back and forth. They had a great deal of respect for each other. Alexander II had what ambition in mind? He wanted to free the serfs, exactly. Lincoln wound up freeing the enslaved people. Russia's serf-based economy couldn't withstand freeing the serfs. Just like what part of our country? The South. It collapsed economically because it had been built on slave labor. The loss of life in the Crimean War was terrible, and a year on into the Crimean War, the Tsar began peace talks, and he basically surrendered. The Treaty of Paris ended the bloodshed. Russia lost its dominance in the Balkans, and its warships were banned from the Black Sea. Later, he defeated the Ottomans in a war to liberate Bulgaria. But Russia had a terrific diplomatic loss. Now, when we come to the Ukraine, what do we remember about Ukraine? It's the birthplace of what? Russia. It's where it all began. Now, what do we have in terms of various language groups? We have a variety and a mixture. They intersect and they pick up languages on their borders as well. Who do we find in the Crimea today? We find some Tartars, but primarily Russians. Now, why? Well, we have the Tatars who are not actually Mongols. They're a mixture of people. They are a mixture of Greeks, Franks, Jews, Italians, Armenians, and Mongols. Takes a long time, but it happens. And the Tatars abhor, they hate Russian rule. You wouldn't know that from some of the propaganda, but that is what we are told. From 1917, we had the Bolshevik Revolution, and then we had, after the death of Lenin, Stalin's rule, which was, he's not, again, not a Russian. He was a Georgian. Stalin said, "Let us hope, comrades, that by forming our Union Republic, we shall create a reliable bulwark against international capitalism, and that the new Union state will be another decisive step toward the union of the working people of the whole world into a world Soviet Socialist Republic." Now, he didn't achieve that. In fact, he didn't actually work toward it because it wasn't feasible in his time, but it was his ambition. He died in, anybody remember the year? 53. Now, there was a bit of a struggle for power, and a Ukrainian became the head of the Soviet Union, and his name was Nikita Khrushchev. In 1954, so the story goes, Khrushchev made a decision to hand the Crimea Peninsula to Ukraine. Well, actually, he didn't have the power to do that all on his own. It was a decision by the legislature. Khrushchev however, did begin a de-Stalinization process. And he encouraged people living in Eastern Europe to believe that he was willing to give them more independence. And he had what was the period of time known as the thaw occurred during that time period. Skip ahead and we have Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev had been in the audience when Khrushchev had made his 22nd Party Congress speech, laying out his de-Stalinization concepts. And he took them to heart. Eventually, that led to his actions in dissolving the Soviet Union. And the former Soviet republics, many of them became independent states. The majority opted for greater independence than the Russians really expected. Now we have the present leader, Vladimir Putin, whose history I think we probably all know. He was an KGB and very well trained in the KGB, stationed in Berlin, knew the East. He entered politics after Boris Yeltsin resigned as president of the RSFSR in 1999. Putin directed the state as either prime minister or president. It didn't make any difference, he still had all the power. His rule was an authoritarian mixture of economic growth, tax reforms, and the repression of any kind of opposition. He embarked on a policy of regaining land, power, and prestige for Russia, and he's terribly anti-Semitic. No kidding. He has widespread corruption throughout his whole administration. It is the period of the rise of the oligarchs, but he has no great loyalty to them because if any one of them gets out of step, well, he may either suddenly have a terrible medical problem or become extinct. Robert Service spoke of Putin. He would do well to consider the precedent of Tsar Nicholas. Now, one of the things that within our own time has occurred is the Russo-Georgian War of 2008. And during that war, Putin moved in and seized land that was Georgian. As we can see, South Ossetia and other areas there. Note the location of Abkhazia on the Black Sea. That's kind of an important area for Russia. So what happened in 2014? There was this spontaneous uprising in Ukraine and in Crimea, in which they said, we want to be Russian. Putin's ultimate objective was to try and take Kiev if he could. And if the consequences weren't too severe for him. That was quoted in The Monkey Cage, which is a publication. Certainly there are those whose pro-Russian demonstrations in Donetsk encouraged that type of Russian ambition, despite warnings from NATO and the US. But essentially, what we had was an invasion, an undeclared invasion.
Why were we so undeclared?
Pardon?
Why were we so unprepared?
Why were we so unprepared?
Yes.
I don't think we wanted to be part of that type of extended warfare. We're already engaged. Don't forget the years, 2014. And we had by that time been at war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and Syria was on the, yep, absolutely. What would you say?
The threat of the EU, including that Ukraine into the West. And we were unprepared for Russia's reaction.
Why wouldn't we have been unprepared? Because we looked at Russia from our perspective, not from theirs. And when you look at it from Russia's perspective, it's saying what? We are being threatened on our perimeter. And if anybody had studied their Russian history or had any knowledge, they should have been prepared. But what do we require? Very little in the way of non-US history or any kind of knowledge of things outside of our own backyards. Now I know I'm over time, but we'll. Okay, enjoy this. Not really, no, I think it's photoshopped. But he enjoys that image. If you notice, he loves to have his picture taken shirtless.
Yeah, if you look at Saturday Night Live, whenever they have his, one of the imitators, he's always bare chested.
Yeah, exactly. So, there he is riding a bear. Is it in the spirit of the czars, the commissars, the marauding invaders of the past? You take your pick. Mm-hmm. By sending troops into Korea and into Crimea, yeah, he probably would do that. By sending troops into Crimea and to eastern Ukraine, Russia could secure another buffer, couldn't it? And that's what it was looking to do. It could also have its strategic naval fleet at its western border. The New York Times said that within 1 day's sail of the Mediterranean, the Russians could reach the Mediterranean, which would be crucial to Mideast trade, and they could interrupt all of Europe and US trade in that direction. So, although it's just across the Caspian Sea. So, what have we? We have the pro-Russian control in eastern Ukraine, and what comes next?
No, we have too much military there, you can't do it. And the Canadians.
Okay, I don't think that the cartoonist meant it quite literally, but I couldn't get this into the presentation, but I love the cartoon. It shows a Red Square parade, and it has all of the usual armaments, but then it has one group, and excuse me, it says hackers. Or if you have any questions or if you'd like to make any comments. Mhm.
You know,